Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. This happened a couple of years ago in the house where I used to live. I have moved since then, although I do not know whether moving made any difference. Nothing like it has happened again, but I still think about it more often than I would like. I have experienced strange things before. Old houses make noises. Lights sometimes flicker. You occasionally hear your name when no one has called you. Most of those things are easy to explain if you wait long enough. This was different. I had never heard of anyone experiencing anything like it, and even now, I do not know how to describe it without sounding unbelievable. It began on what had been a completely normal day. There had been nothing unusual that morning or afternoon. I had not been watching horror films or reading ghost stories. I was not tired enough to be confused, and I had not taken anything that might have affected my mind. By late afternoon or early evening, I was sitting in the bedroom with my boyfriend. The room was quiet. He was lying beside me, looking at his phone and doing whatever he normally did online. He had his sound low, and we were not really talking. I was watching one of my favorite live streams on TikTok. The creator did paranormal content almost every day. Sometimes he explored supposedly haunted places. Other times he used different pieces of equipment and allowed his audience to listen while he tried to contact spirits. I never believed everything that happened during those streams. Sometimes the sounds were so unclear that people in the comments could make them mean almost anything. One person would hear a name, another would hear a warning, and someone else would insist it was only radio interference. Still, I enjoyed watching. That day, the creator was using a spirit box. For anyone who has never seen one, a spirit box quickly scans through radio frequencies, producing short bursts of voices, music, static, and noise. Paranormal investigators believe spirits can use those pieces of sound to form words or sentences. Skeptics say people only hear what they expect to hear. I was somewhere in the middle. I thought it was entertaining, but I did not take it too seriously. The live stream looked completely normal when I joined. The creator sat near a table with the spirit box in front of him. The device produced a constant mix of static and broken radio voices. He asked questions. Is anyone here with me? Can you tell me your name? Is there something you want us to know? The comment section moved quickly. Viewers typed the words they believed they heard. I could hear the creator. I could hear the sounds around him. I could hear the spirit box. He could not hear me, of course. I was only one person among hundreds or perhaps thousands watching the stream. My microphone was not connected. I was not speaking to him through a video call. I was simply sitting in my bedroom, watching. Then, the spirit box said my name. At first, I thought I had imagined it. There had been a burst of static, followed by a clear voice. My name. Not something similar. Not a word I could force into sounding like it. My exact name. I stared at the screen. The creator continued speaking as though nothing had happened. The comments did not change. No one wrote my name. No one asked who the spirit was talking to. I told myself it was a coincidence. Names appear on radio broadcasts all the time. Maybe the device had caught part of an advert, a song, or a presenter speaking. Then it said my name again. This time, the voice was clearer. It sounded close, almost as though it came from the phone's speaker instead of through the noisy device on the live stream. I sat up. My boyfriend glanced at me for a second before returning to his phone. "What?" he asked. Nothing. I did not want to sound foolish. The creator asked another question. The spirit box answered him with something unclear. Then, beneath the static, I heard a different voice. "Can you hear us?" I stopped breathing. The creator did not react. The comments continued moving normally. People were discussing a completely different word they thought they had heard. I looked around the bedroom. Nothing had changed. My boyfriend remained beside me. The door was open. The light was on. There was no reason to be frightened. I whispered, yes, I expected nothing to happen. The voice answered, "We hear you." My whole body became cold. The words did not sound like random pieces of radio anymore. They came together naturally, like one side of a telephone conversation. I looked toward my boyfriend. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "The live stream." He listened for a moment. All that came through was static and the creator's voice. "What about it?" "It said something." He shrugged. "That's the point, isn't it?" "No, it spoke to me." My boyfriend gave me a confused look, but did not seem worried. He returned to his phone. I watched the comments again. No one was reacting to what I heard. The creator smiled and continued asking questions. The stream had not paused or changed. The voices spoke again. They said my name a third time. Then one asked, "Why are you scared?" I should have closed the app immediately. Instead, I answered, "I don't know." The reply came almost at once. "You do know." I felt sick. There were several voices now. At least, I believed there were. One sounded like a man. Another seemed lighter, perhaps a woman. Sometimes they overlapped. Other times, one voice completed a thought started by another. They did not speak loudly. I had to focus to hear them beneath the spirit box noise. But the words were clear to me. "What do you want?" I asked. The creator on the live stream continued speaking over me. He could not hear my question, yet the voices responded directly. "To talk." "Why me?" "You listened." I watched the comment section. Someone wrote that they had heard the word cold. Another person thought they heard leave. No one mentioned my name or the conversation. I turned the phone's volume higher. My boyfriend complained about the noise. I lowered it slightly, but kept listening. The voices began saying stranger things. Some sentences did not make sense. They mentioned a door, a woman standing behind someone, a number that meant nothing to me. One voice told me not to turn around. I immediately looked behind me. There was only the wall and part of the headboard. Another voice laughed. The laugh sounded distorted, as if several radio stations had produced it together. "Stop," I whispered. "Stop what?" my boyfriend asked. "Not you." He looked at me properly then. "Who are you talking to?" "The box." He stared at the live stream. The creator was asking whether a spirit had died inside the building he was investigating. My boyfriend listened. "I just hear static. They're talking to me." "Who?" "I don't know." He probably thought I was joking. Then the voices said something personal. It was not the most private detail they would mention later, but it was something a random radio broadcast could not have known. They referred to the room I was sitting in. One voice described the color of an object beside my bed. I looked toward it. The description was correct. I felt pressure building in my chest. I asked, "Can you see me?" The answer came through clearly. "Yes." I lowered the phone. For several seconds, I only stared at the screen. My boyfriend noticed my face. "Are you okay?" No, what happened? It knows things. He took one earbud from me and listened to the stream. The creator spoke. Static burst from the device. A short piece of music played and disappeared. My boyfriend handed the earbud back. I don't hear anything unusual. You didn't hear them? Hear who? They were just talking. He shook his head. I checked the comments again. Nothing. The other viewers were hearing the same normal live stream my boyfriend heard. Only I seemed to hear the voices speaking directly to me. That frightened me more than if everyone had heard them. If the creator had reacted, I could have blamed some trick in the live stream. Maybe he had read my username and decided to scare me. But he was not reacting. The comments were not reacting. It was as though a second conversation existed underneath the live stream, meant only for me. The voices continued. They asked questions about my life. They mentioned someone who had hurt me. At the time, I was still trying to heal from a traumatic physical violation. I did not speak about it openly. Only a few people knew the details. The experience had left me feeling unsafe in ways that were difficult to explain. I sometimes checked locks repeatedly. I became nervous when someone walked too closely behind me. Certain sounds and smells could bring the whole memory back. The voices seemed to know that. One said, "You still see him." My fingers tightened around the phone. I did not answer. Another voice asked, "Why didn't you fight?" My eyes filled with tears. "Stop, you remember. Stop talking." My boyfriend sat up. "What is it saying?" I could not tell him. The voice used a phrase connected to the attack, a phrase that had been spoken during it. No one online could have known those words. I closed my eyes. The voices seemed pleased that they had frightened me. One laughed. Another said, "We found you." I opened my eyes and looked toward the creator. He continued the session normally. He had no idea what I was hearing. The conversation lasted for around 10 minutes. It may have been shorter. It may have been longer. Fear can make time difficult to measure. During those minutes, the voices responded whenever I spoke. If I asked a question, they answered. If I remained silent, they called my name. Sometimes they repeated something I had just thought without saying aloud. That part is harder for me to prove even to myself. Perhaps I had whispered without noticing. Perhaps the words were general enough to fit my thoughts. But at the time, it felt as though something was reaching directly into my mind. Finally, I could not take it anymore. I closed the live stream. The sound stopped immediately. The room became quiet. My boyfriend asked what had happened. I tried explaining it, but the story sounded impossible even while I was telling it. The spirit box was talking to me. "What do you mean?" It said my name. It answered me. "Did the creator read your username?" No, he didn't hear it. Maybe someone in the chat was messing with you. No one else reacted. My boyfriend tried to calm me. He said spirit boxes scan radio stations. They can produce strange combinations of words. If I was already emotional, my brain might have connected those sounds into sentences. That was possible. I wanted it to be true. But I could not stop thinking about the personal things the voices had said, especially the reference to the attack. I opened an AI chatbot on my phone. I had used it before to ask questions and organize my thoughts. I decided to ask whether spirit boxes could create sounds that seemed like full conversations, or whether stress could make someone hear patterns in static. I began typing. Something like, "Can a spirit box make it sound like someone is talking directly to you?" Before I finished, part of the sentence disappeared. I stopped. I thought I had pressed the wrong button. I typed it again. The words were deleted. Not all at once. They vanished one group at a time, as if someone were holding down the backspace key. Then, new letters appeared. I was not touching the screen. I watched them form a name. The first name of the person who attacked me. My body went completely still. More letters appeared, his last name. The full name sat inside the message box. I dropped the phone onto the bed. My boyfriend looked over. "What now?" I pointed. The name remained on the screen. He knew who it was. "How did you type that?" I didn't. He picked up the phone. The cursor moved. New words appeared beneath the name. They described part of what had happened to me. Not every detail, but enough. A location. Something he had said. A specific action. My boyfriend stared at the phone. I grabbed it from him and tried deleting the text. The words returned. Then another sentence began forming. "Tell her to come back." I did not understand at first. A full name appeared after it. The first and last name of a friend who had recently left the house. She had visited earlier that day. The message repeated itself. "Tell to come back." My boyfriend asked whether she knew about the attack. She knew some of it, but that did not explain why her full name appeared. I closed the chatbot. It reopened. I tried switching to another app. The text continued appearing over the screen. "Tell her to come back." I pressed the power button. The screen went dark. A second later, it lit up again. The same sentence was there. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone again. I held the power button until the device completely shut down. This time, the screen stayed black. The bedroom became silent. I could hear my own breathing. My boyfriend asked whether I had installed anything strange. I had not. He wondered whether someone had hacked my phone. That was the first reasonable explanation we could think of. Maybe the live stream contained some malicious link. Maybe someone had gained remote access. Maybe the AI app had a serious error. But even a hacker would need information. They would need the attacker's full name. They would need private details of what he had done. They would need to know that my friend had been at the house and had recently left. I had not typed any of that into the chatbot. I had not mentioned my friend during the live stream. My boyfriend suggested calling the police, but what could I tell them? A spirit box spoke to me through TikTok, and then an invisible person typed private information on my phone. They would have assumed I was confused or frightened. Maybe I was. I left the phone turned off for a long time. When I finally switched it back on, everything appeared normal. The chatbot conversation was empty. There was no record of the attacker's name, no message about my friend, no strange text. It was as though none of it had happened. I checked the live stream creators page. The video was no longer live. I searched for a saved recording, but I could not find one. Even if I had found it, I already knew what it would probably contain. The creator asking questions. The spirit box producing random noise. No private conversation. That was what everyone else had heard. I contacted my friend. I asked whether anything unusual had happened after she left. She said no. I did not tell her immediately that something had demanded she return. I was afraid she would come back out of concern, and I did not want that. My boyfriend stayed close to me for the rest of the evening. We turned on the lights in every room. We checked the doors and windows. Nothing appeared wrong inside the house. Later that same day, it happened again. It did not last as long. My phone was sitting on a table when the screen turned on by itself. The AI chatbot opened. A few words appeared. "You heard us." Then, "He knows." I picked up the phone. The typing stopped. I closed the app. It opened again. A final sentence appeared. "We can talk without the box." I shut the phone off immediately. That was the last time it happened. The device worked normally after that. I continued using the same phone for months. No one accessed my accounts. My passwords were not changed. There were no strange purchases or messages. I searched online for similar experiences. I found people claiming that spirit boxes had said their names. I found stories about phones typing by themselves, apps opening, and dead relatives contacting people through electronic devices. Most of the stories were impossible to prove. Some clearly sounded invented. None matched exactly what happened to me. I considered whether the whole thing had been caused by trauma. The mind can do powerful things when someone is trying to heal. Stress can affect memory, attention, and the way sounds are understood. Maybe I heard random pieces of radio noise and connected them to my fears. Maybe my phone had a serious technical problem at the worst possible moment. Maybe I typed the names myself without remembering. I do not like that explanation, but I have considered it. What bothers me is that my boyfriend saw the text. He watched the attacker's name appear. He saw the message about my friend. He may not have heard the voices during the live stream, but he saw what happened afterward. The event also seemed to understand exactly where my fear lived. It did not choose random information. It chose the most painful thing that had happened to me. It used the name of the person who caused it. It repeated details that made me feel powerless again. Then it tried to bring my friend back to the house. I still wonder what would have happened if I had called her. Would nothing have happened? Would the phone have stopped? Or did whatever was communicating want another person nearby for a reason? I moved out of that house later. The move was not only because of this incident. There were other reasons, and nothing similar happened again before I left. Still, I remember the bedroom clearly, the late afternoon light. My boyfriend looking at his phone. The TikTok creator speaking normally while another conversation came through beneath his voice. I remember hearing my name. I remember answering. That was my biggest mistake. Perhaps I gave the sounds meaning by responding. Perhaps someone hacking the stream noticed that I was frightened. Or perhaps something heard me through a device that was never supposed to hear its audience. I no longer watch Spirit Box live streams. I do not care whether they are real, fake, or nothing more than radio noise. Whenever I hear static now, I listen for my name. Sometimes I think I can hear it. A small voice hidden beneath the noise. I never answer. I still use AI chatbots, although I sometimes feel nervous when the cursor pauses or a letter disappears unexpectedly. Technical errors happen. Screens freeze. Keyboards make mistakes. That is what I tell myself. But every now and then, I remember the sentence that appeared before I shut the phone down. We can talk without the box. Maybe the spirit box did not create anything. Maybe it only opened a door. Maybe the voices had always been nearby, waiting for something that could turn them into sound. I do not know what it was. A hacker. A technical failure. A trauma response. Something paranormal. I have never found an explanation that accounts for all of it. All I know is that hundreds of people were watching the same live stream. They heard static. They heard the creator. They heard random voices passing through radio stations. I heard something else. It knew my name. It knew what had happened to me. And after I closed the live stream, it followed me into another app. A few months ago, two of my friends decided to spend the night at an old plantation property in the Deep South. The property belonged to another friend of ours. His family had owned it for years, but he rarely visited. The land was far away from the nearest town, and the main house had been standing for longer than anyone in our group really knew. My friend had told us several stories about the place over the years. None of them were dramatic enough to sound like something from a horror film. He had never claimed to see a transparent woman walking through a wall or a headless figure crossing the yard. Most of his stories involve smaller things. Footsteps in empty rooms. Doors found open after he was sure he had closed them. A voice calling from another part of the house. when no one else was there. Once, he said he woke during the night and heard someone dragging a heavy object across the floor downstairs. When he checked in the morning, nothing had moved. He never insisted the house was haunted. He usually laughed while telling the stories, but there was always a point where his expression changed. The smile would disappear for a second, and he would look as though he had remembered a detail he did not want to discuss. The house itself was old and badly maintained. It had a wide front porch, tall windows, and several rooms that no one used anymore. The paint had peeled from parts of the exterior, and thick vines climbed one side of the building. The property was surrounded by fields, woods, and long stretches of empty land. At night, there were no nearby streetlights and very little traffic. Once the sun went down, the darkness around the house became complete. My two friends knew about the stories when they decided to stay there. They did not go because they wanted to investigate anything. They only wanted somewhere different to hang out. They drove to the property one evening with bags of Taco Bell, drinks, blankets, and enough clothes to stay until the next morning. According to them, something felt wrong the moment they left the highway. The entrance to the property was reached by a narrow road that ran between trees. It was rough and uneven, but the car they were using had traveled over worse roads before. Still, as soon as they turned onto the property, the car began making strange noises. At first, there was a light knocking sound beneath the floor. Then came a rough grinding noise near the front of the vehicle. One of my friends thought they had picked up a branch or damaged something while turning from the highway. They stopped and checked beneath the car, but nothing appeared to be wrong. The tires looked fine. There was nothing trapped underneath. No warning lights appeared on the dashboard. They continued toward the house. The sound returned. It became louder the closer they came to the building. My friends were already nervous by the time they parked. They carried their food and bags inside, unlocked the main door, and turned on several lamps. The electricity worked, although some of the lights flickered when they first came on. The house had been empty for a while, so the air smelled of dust and old wood. The rooms were warm and still. Every step caused the floorboards to creak. They chose the main living room because it was the most comfortable part of the house. There were two old sofas, a table, and a radio sitting on a cabinet near the wall. They opened their food and tried to relax. Neither of them could. They both described feeling watched almost immediately. It was not connected to one particular doorway or window. The feeling seemed to come from the whole house. They tried talking and joking, but the silence between their words felt too heavy. Each time one of them stopped speaking, both became aware of how empty the building was. Then the old radio turned on. Neither of them was near it. The radio had large physical controls, not a modern digital button that might be activated by a timer or remote control. Static burst from the speaker. My friends jumped. One of them stood and switched it off. Before he reached the sofa again, both of their phones went dark. Not low battery warnings, not weak signals. Both phones completely shut down at almost the exact same time. One had been above 70% battery. The other had been charging in the car during the drive. They tried turning them back on. Nothing happened. By then, they were terrified. They packed everything as quickly as they could, leaving some of the food behind. They rushed to the car, locked the house, and drove away. The strange noises continued while they traveled down the property road. As soon as they reached the highway, the sound stopped. Both phones powered on by themselves. The battery levels returned to what they had been before. My friends called us as soon as they had enough signal. They spoke over each other while explaining what happened. I did not believe the property had caused any of it. Both of them were easily frightened by paranormal stories. If a house made one strange noise at night, they would immediately believe something was inside it. I told them the car had probably been reacting to the rough road. The radio might have had an electrical problem. Their phones could have crashed because of heat, a software issue, or some other normal reason. The fact that everything returned to normal near the highway was strange, but strange did not mean supernatural. They insisted I would understand if I stayed in the house myself. Not long afterward, the friend who owned the property asked whether I wanted to spend a weekend there with him. I agreed. Part of me wanted to prove that our other friends had frightened themselves over nothing. Another part was honestly curious. We arrived during the day. In sunlight, the house looked tired rather than frightening. The porch boards bent slightly beneath our feet. Dust covered the windows, and dead insects had collected near the doors. Inside, the rooms were large but mostly empty. Some old furniture remained, along with framed pictures that had belonged to people connected to the property years before. The main house had clearly been changed many times. Certain walls looked newer than others. Some doorways had been sealed, and one section of the floor had boards that did not match the rest. My friend showed me where we would sleep and then walked me around the property. Nothing strange happened. The car did not make any unusual sounds. My phone worked normally. We spent most of the afternoon outside, talking and cleaning up a few areas around the house. That evening, we drove into town for dinner. By the time we returned, it was fully dark. The property looked different at night. Our headlights moved across the trees and briefly lit the front of the house. The windows looked completely black, like empty spaces cut into the walls. Still, I did not feel frightened. I reminded myself that it was only an old building in an isolated place. We carried our things inside, opened a few beers, and sat around talking. For the first couple of hours, nothing happened. We joked about our friends leaving their Taco Bell behind. My friend claimed he had found part of one meal still sitting on a table when he returned days later. We laughed about how quickly they had escaped. Around 11 or midnight, we decided to explore the main house more carefully. We had already had a few beers, so neither of us was especially nervous. We walked around with our phones as flashlights, opening doors and looking inside rooms my friend rarely entered. Some contained old chairs, broken lamps, or boxes filled with papers. Others were empty. The house made plenty of noise as we moved through it. The floor creaked. The walls sometimes clicked as the temperature changed. Branches rubbed lightly against one of the upstairs windows. Every sound seemed easy to explain. When we first entered the main part of the house, we used the front door. I was the last person through it. My friend walked ahead of me into the entrance hall. I stopped with one hand on the door. "Should I close this all the way?" I asked. He turned. "Why wouldn't you? In case something weird happens and we need to get out quickly." My friend laughed. "Shut it." I looked at the old lock. The door had a heavy deadbolt and a small chain lock on the inside. My friend pointed toward them. "Maybe the ghosts will lock it behind us and scare the hell out of us." I laughed too. "Great. Now you've given them the idea." I gently pulled the door closed. I did not touch the deadbolt. I did not touch the chain. I clearly remember that. The door shut with a heavy wooden sound. Then, I followed my friend into the house. He remained in front of me the entire time. That detail matters. He never returned to the entrance. He could not have locked the door as a prank without me noticing. We entered the main living room. It was one of the largest rooms in the house, with a tall ceiling and several windows facing the front porch. There was an old fireplace on one wall. The furniture had been pushed toward the edges of the room, leaving a wide open space in the middle. My friend pointed out a dark mark above the fireplace and told me it had always been there. Someone had tried painting over it, but it continued showing through. We joked about it being a blood stain, although it looked more like smoke damage. The house remained quiet. Then my friend stopped speaking. He turned his head toward the entrance. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "A noise near the front door." I listened. "Nothing. What kind of noise?" "I don't know. Like metal." I laughed. "You're imagining things now. I heard something. It's an old house." He continued looking toward the hallway. I reminded him that he had been the one making ghost jokes. He shook his head and walked into the next room. We explored for several more minutes. Nothing unusual happened. There were no voices, footsteps, or moving objects. Eventually, we decided we had seen enough. We planned to return to the smaller part of the property where we had left our drinks and belongings. My friend walked ahead again. I followed him through the living room and into the entrance hall. When we reached the front door, he grabbed the handle. It did not move. He tried again. "Did you lock this?" "No." He looked at me. "It's locked." I assumed he was joking. "Open it." "I'm trying." He turned the handle and pulled harder. The door remained closed. Then I saw the deadbolt. It had been turned into the locked position. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. My friend reached up and tried moving it. The lock was old and stiff. Even when you wanted to use it, you had to push the door firmly and force the metal part around. It could not have slipped into place on its own. "Did you do that?" he asked. "No. You were the last one at the door." I closed it. "That's all." He stared at me as though trying to decide whether I was lying. Then his eyes moved higher. The chain lock was fastened too. That frightened me more than the deadbolt. A deadbolt might possibly move if the door or building shifted in some unusual way. I did not believe that had happened, but at least I could imagine someone trying to explain it. The chain was different. It had to be lifted by hand. The end had to be placed into a small metal track and slid into the correct position. Gravity could not do it. A shaking door could not do it. It required deliberate movement. My friend touched the chain. "When did you put this on?" "I didn't. You had to." "I didn't touch it." He looked back toward the dark hallway. The house became very quiet. I remembered his earlier words. "Maybe the ghosts will lock it behind us." I remembered the metallic sound he claimed to hear while we were standing in the living room. At the time, I had told him he was imagining things. Now, I understood exactly what the sound might have been. Someone fastening the locks. We checked the entrance hall. There was nowhere for a person to hide near the door. We had not seen anyone else enter the property. My friend and I had been together since returning from dinner. No one could have entered without us hearing or seeing them. I unfastened the chain. My hands were shaking enough to make the task difficult. Then we tried the deadbolt. It would not turn at first. My friend pushed against the door while I forced the lock. The metal made a hard scraping sound. For a moment, I had the terrible thought that something on the other side was holding it in place. Then the bolt moved. We pulled the door open. Cold night air entered the hall. Neither of us said anything. We ran outside. We did not stop to search the house again or investigate how the locks had moved. We returned to the car, started it, and left the property. My friend drove much faster than he should have along the narrow road. I kept looking through the back window. The house remained dark. I did not see anyone standing on the porch or watching from the windows. Nothing followed us. When we reached the main road, both of us began talking at the same time. We went through every moment again. I had closed the door. My friend had remained ahead of me. Neither of us had returned to the entrance. No one else had been inside. The deadbolt had been difficult to unlock because of its age. It was impossible to believe it had turned by itself. The chain was even harder to explain. One of us would have needed to stand directly beside the door, lift the chain, and place it into the bracket. Neither of us had done that. The detail that unsettled me most was the joke. We had specifically spoken about that exact door. I had asked whether we should leave it open in case something strange happened. My friend had laughed and said the ghosts might lock it behind us. Then, a few minutes later, we found the deadbolt and chain fastened. It felt deliberate, as though something inside the house had heard us, as though it had understood what would frighten us and decided to do exactly that. I tried finding a normal explanation afterward. Perhaps one of us had locked the door without remembering. That is the simplest answer. But I know what I did. I held the edge of the door and gently pulled it closed. My hands never went near either lock. My friend was in front of me the entire time. He could not have returned without walking past me. Maybe someone else had been inside. That possibility is not comforting either. For a hidden person to lock the door, they would have needed to enter the hallway after us, fasten both locks, and then disappear without making enough noise for us to notice. We searched the nearby rooms before leaving. There were no open windows or other signs of an intruder. Even if a person had done it, I do not understand why they would trap us inside and then allow us to leave. My friend later returned during the daytime with several other people. They checked the door. The locks worked exactly as we remembered. The deadbolt required effort. The chain could not move unless someone lifted it. They tried slamming the door repeatedly. Neither lock engaged. They shook the handle and pushed against the frame. Nothing happened. There was no mechanical explanation. The friends who had left after the radio and phone incident were not surprised when we told them. They said the property changed as soon as you crossed onto the land. They believed something there did not want visitors. I still do not know whether I agree. I had never experienced anything paranormal before that night. I have not experienced anything similar since. I am still not claiming the house is haunted. I do not know enough to say what happened with certainty. Maybe there is an explanation we failed to notice. Maybe stress, darkness, and alcohol affected our memories. But there are certain facts I cannot change. I did not touch the locks. My friend did not return to the door. The deadbolt and chain were both fastened from the inside. And while we were in the living room, my friend heard metal moving near the entrance. Sometimes I think about the house listening to us laugh. I imagine something standing in the dark hallway after we walked away. It hears my friend make the joke. It waits until we are far enough inside. Then it approaches the front door. First, it forces the heavy deadbolt into place. Then it lifts the chain and slowly slides it into the bracket. Not because it wants to keep us forever, only because it wants us to know that we are not alone. I have never shared this story properly before. It happened a few years ago, during the first COVID lockdown. Even now, I sometimes wonder whether I should have told someone sooner, but I never knew how to explain it without sounding ridiculous. I have never considered myself a strong believer in the paranormal. I am not the type of person who hears a noise in an old house and immediately thinks it must be a ghost. I usually look for a sensible answer first. Old pipes knock. Wooden floors move. Shadows change when cars pass outside. People imagine things when they are tired, frightened, or ill. I need something solid before I believe it. That is one of the reasons this experience has stayed with me for so long. I still cannot find a normal explanation that fits everything I heard and felt that night. At the time, I was living in a rented house in England. The building itself was fairly new. It did not look haunted. There were no ancient wooden beams, broken windows, or dark stone hallways. It looked like any other modern rented home. But the land beneath it had a much older history. Before the houses were built, there had been a very old pub on the site. The pub had stood there for generations and had many strange stories connected to it. Local people talked about hidden tunnels beneath the ground. According to one story, the tunnels linked the pub to an old manor house nearby. No one seemed to agree on why they had been built. Some said smugglers used them. Others claimed servants from the manor traveled through them without being seen. There were also stories about secret meetings, stolen goods, and people disappearing beneath the pub. I never paid much attention to any of it. Every old building seems to collect stories after enough time. The more years that pass, the stranger those stories become. The house stood beside a very old Roman road. Under normal conditions, the road was busy for most of the day and night. Cars, vans, buses, and lorries passed constantly. Even when I was indoors, I could usually hear the low sound of engines outside. The traffic became part of the background. You stopped noticing it after a while. Then the lockdown began. Everything changed almost overnight. The road became strangely empty. Shops closed. People stayed inside their homes. The sound of traffic almost disappeared. It was one of the most unsettling parts of that period. Places that were normally full of life suddenly felt abandoned. That particular night, it was around 10:30 or 11 when I decided to go outside for a cigarette. The rest of the house was quiet. I opened the front door and stepped onto the small path outside. The front garden was not large. A short path led from the door to the gate, and beyond the gate was the road. A thick hedge stood along the edge of the property. It was tall enough to block most of my view of the road. Usually, I could not see passing cars until they reached the small opening near the gate, but I could always hear them. That night, I heard nothing. No tires on the road, no engines, no distant voices, not even a dog barking. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It did not feel peaceful. It felt unnatural. I stood near the front door and lit my cigarette. The flame briefly lit my hand and the wall beside me. Then it disappeared, leaving only the small orange glow at the end of the cigarette. I took a breath and looked toward the hedge. The night was cool, but not unusually cold. There was no fog when I first stepped outside. The sky was dark, and the air was still. For the first minute or so, nothing happened. I was simply standing there, smoking. Then the temperature dropped. It did not cool slowly. One moment, the air felt normal. The next, it was freezing. The change was so sudden that my skin tightened. My arms became covered in goosebumps, and my breath felt cold in my throat. I remember looking down at the cigarette as though it might somehow explain what had happened. Then the feeling came. I still find it difficult to describe. It was more than fear. Fear usually has a reason. You see or hear something dangerous, and your body reacts. This feeling arrived before anything had happened. It felt like grief, like someone had just told me the worst news of my life. My stomach turned. My chest became heavy. Every part of me seemed to understand that something terrible was nearby, even though I had not seen anything. It was a deep, sick feeling, the kind of dread that makes your body feel weak. I wanted to go back inside, but I did not move. Then the fog appeared. There had been no mist on the road when I came outside. There was no slow cloud moving toward me. It simply arrived. 1 second, I could see the path, the gate, and the hedge. The next thick white fog surrounded me. It was so dense that the garden disappeared. I could not see the front gate. I could not see the hedge. I could barely see my own hand. The only clear thing in front of me was the glowing end of the cigarette. I stared at it. The orange light floated in the darkness like a tiny lamp. For several seconds, I did not understand what I was seeing. Fog does not usually appear like that. It moves in. It gathers. This had covered everything in an instant. The dread inside me became stronger. I turned slightly toward the front door. It was only a step or two behind me, but even that felt far away. Then I heard something. At first, the sound was faint, a slow, uneven rhythm in the distance. I held my breath and listened. It came from the direction of the road. The sound grew clearer. Hooves, a horse, was coming along the road. I could hear each hoof striking the ground. The rhythm was heavy, but not fast. Clip, clop, clip, clop. There was more than one horse. I could hear their breathing, too. Deep, tired breaths. The animals sounded as though they had been traveling for a long time. Every breath came with a rough pull, followed by a forceful release. Then I heard the wheels. Wooden wheels rolling over the road. They made a hard, rough sound that did not belong on modern tarmac. Metal rattled with every movement. Chains, buckles, harnesses, something inside or beneath the carriage shook as it traveled. The whole sound was becoming louder. I told myself it must be someone with horses. Maybe a local rider had taken them out late because the roads were empty. But I knew that was not what I was hearing. This was not the light sound of a modern horse trailer. It sounded old, a real carriage, the kind you would see in a film about the Victorian period. The horses came closer. Their breathing became louder. The wheels rattled. The chains pulled tight, then loosened with every step. I was still standing beside the front door. I could not move. I wanted to step inside and close it, but my body would not listen. The cigarette remained between my fingers. I did not even raise it to my mouth. The carriage reached the road directly in front of the house. The hedge blocked my view even without the fog, but at that moment I could see nothing at all. I could only listen. The horses passed the gate. Their hooves sounded close enough that I expected to feel the ground shaking. The carriage followed. The wheels creaked. Metal struck metal. Something moved inside it. I thought I heard fabric dragging or shifting, but I could not be certain. I also had the strong feeling that someone was looking toward me from the road. I could not see them. They could not possibly see me through the hedge and fog, but I felt watched. The feeling of sickness became almost unbearable. For a few seconds, I wondered whether I was going to faint. Then, the carriage continued past the house. The sound moved slowly down the road. Hooves, wheels, chains, labored breathing. It became quieter. Then everything stopped. Not faded. Stopped, the noise disappeared instantly. At the same moment, the fog vanished. The garden returned. The path, the hedge, the gate. The air became warmer. The terrible feeling inside my chest disappeared. I stood there in complete silence. My cigarette had burned almost to the filter. I looked toward the road, expecting to see the back of a carriage moving away. There was nothing. No horses, no lights, no tracks, no sound. The road was empty. I dropped the cigarette and crushed it beneath my shoe. Then I went inside. I closed and locked the door. For a while, I stood in the hallway trying to understand what had happened. The sensible part of my mind began creating explanations immediately. Maybe there had been a real horse-drawn carriage on the road. Maybe the fog had been a patch of mist moving quickly through the area. Maybe fear had made the sounds seem closer than they were. But none of those explanations felt right. Why had the temperature changed so suddenly? Why had the fog appeared and disappeared in seconds? Why had the feeling of dread arrived before the sound? And why had every part of the experience ended at exactly the same moment? I laughed at myself. It was an uncomfortable laugh. I told myself I was tired. Lockdown had affected everyone. The days felt strange, and the silent streets made normal sounds seem unusual. I had probably heard something ordinary and allowed my imagination to turn it into a carriage. That was the explanation I chose. I buried the memory. I did not mention it to friends or family. I knew what people would say. Some would laugh. Others would immediately call it a ghost. Neither reaction would help me. For years, I tried not to think about it. But every so often, I remembered the sound of the horses breathing. That was the detail I could never dismiss. It had sounded real, not distant or dreamlike. The horses had sounded exhausted. I could hear the strain in their lungs. I could hear the harness moving against their bodies. I could hear the weight of the carriage behind them. It felt less like hearing an echo from the past and more like standing beside something that had entered the present. There was another strange event connected to that house. This one happened to my father shortly before the first official COVID cases were being widely discussed. It was around December. Dad became extremely ill. Looking back, we believe he may have had COVID before we knew it was spreading, but we cannot prove it. He had a high fever, a terrible cough, and very little energy. He was in a bad way for several days. One night, he slept on the sofa downstairs because he could not get comfortable in bed. He wanted to sit upright, and the sofa made breathing slightly easier. The next morning, he looked disturbed. He said he had experienced the most frightening hallucination of his life. My dad sometimes sees strange things when he has a very high temperature. Because of that, we normally would not have taken the story too seriously. But the details were unusual. He said he had woken during the night and seen a woman enter the room. She did not come through the door. She walked through the wall. The woman wore old-fashioned clothing. He described a long dress that looked Victorian, with layers of dark fabric and a fitted upper part. He could see her body clearly, but she had no head. She walked from one wall, crossed part of the room, and disappeared through another. Dad said the experience felt completely real. He knew he was ill. He knew he could have been hallucinating. But even after his fever disappeared, he remained certain about what he had seen. That alone was strange. The more disturbing detail was the history of the pub that had once stood on the land. The pub was called the Headless Woman. Dad knew the name, but we had not been talking about it recently. He had not been reading old stories about the building before he fell asleep. Still, the figure he saw matched the name exactly. A woman in Victorian clothing, walking through the old pub site, without a head. I tried to explain that experience too. He had a fever. He was sick. His mind could have created the image from something he had heard years earlier. That is possible. I still believe it is the most likely explanation. But it became harder to dismiss after my own experience with the carriage. Both events happened on land connected to the same old pub. Both felt as though something from another time had briefly appeared inside the modern house. My father saw a Victorian woman. I heard a horse and carriage traveling along an ancient road. The old Roman road had existed for centuries before cars used it. Countless people had traveled along it on foot, on horseback, and in carriages. Perhaps the silence of the lockdown allowed me to hear something that was normally covered by traffic. That thought frightens me more than the idea of a simple ghost. What if old places are always replaying their past? What if the sounds are still there beneath the engines, voices, and modern life? Maybe we usually cannot hear them because the world is too loud. During lockdown, the road became quiet. For the first time in years, Perhaps nothing stood between me and whatever had always been passing the house. I later tried to find more information about the pub. Most of what I discovered was difficult to confirm. Local stories changed depending on who told them. Some people said the pub's name came from a woman who had been murdered nearby. Others claimed it referred to an old sign showing a woman without a head. There were stories of strange sounds, underground passages, and people seeing figures near the road. The tunnels were the detail that interested me most. If they really connected the pub to the manor house, they may still have existed beneath the newer buildings. I sometimes wondered whether the carriage sound had come from underground. That would explain why it sounded close without anything appearing on the road. But it would not explain the fog. It would not explain the temperature. And it would not explain the dread. I do not live in that house anymore. I passed the road a few times after moving away. During the day, it looked completely ordinary. Cars rushed past. People walked dogs. The newer houses stood where the pub had once been. There was no sign of hidden tunnels, headless women, or horse-drawn carriages. That almost made the memory feel impossible. Yet I still avoid driving along that road late at night. I have never heard the carriage again. My father never saw the woman again. Maybe both experiences were accidents of the mind. He was ill. I was tired and living through a stressful period. Perhaps that is all there is to it. But when I remember that night, I do not remember feeling confused. I remember knowing that something was approaching. I remember the cold. I remember the fog swallowing the garden. I remember the horses breathing. Most of all, I remember the exact moment the carriage passed in front of the house. For those few seconds, I felt as though the road outside was no longer part of the modern world. The houses were gone. The streetlights were gone. The cars were gone. There was only the old road, the fog, and something traveling through the night. I often wonder what I would have seen if the hedge had not blocked my view. Would there have been a driver? Would there have been passengers inside? Would the horses have looked alive? Or would I have seen nothing at all while the sound moved past me? Part of me is grateful for the hedge. Hearing it was bad enough. Seeing it might have left me with answers I did not want. My dad still insists he knows what he saw on the night of his fever. He says the woman was not a dream. He says she moved too clearly and naturally. I still remind him that illness can make the brain do strange things. Then he asks me about the carriage. I never have an answer. We are both left with experiences we cannot prove. No photographs. No recordings, no marks on the road, only memories. That is probably why the story still plays on my mind. If I had evidence, I could study it. If I discovered a normal explanation, I could forget it. Instead, I am left with the sound of wheels and chains moving through instant fog on an empty Roman road. I still do not call myself a paranormal believer. I still want solid proof. But I no longer laugh when people say they have heard something impossible in an old place. Sometimes, places keep more than their buildings. Sometimes the past may not disappear simply because something new is built over it. And sometimes, when the modern world becomes quiet enough, the old road may become busy again. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. Right after college, my sister and I decided to rent a house together in South Austin. We had both been living alone in separate apartments before that, and our leases were ending around the same time. Renting a place together seemed like a sensible choice. We could split the bills, save money, and finally live close enough to spend more time together. At least, that was the plan. The housing market in Austin was terrible at the time. Every decent rental disappeared almost as soon as it was listed. We would call about a house in the morning and find out by the afternoon that someone had already signed the lease. Some properties were far outside our budget. Others looked good in pictures, but were falling apart when we visited them. One place had water stains covering an entire bedroom ceiling. Another had a back door that did not properly close. One landlord wanted several months of rent before we had even seen the inside. Our apartment leases were getting closer to their final dates, and we were running out of options. Eventually, we became desperate. We found a house in South Austin that was available immediately. It was older, poorly maintained, and located in a part of the city that neither of us knew very well. The outside paint was faded, the garden was mostly weeds, and part of the front porch looked as though it might collapse if someone stepped too hard. The inside was not much better. The wooden floors were scratched. Several doors did not close properly. The kitchen cabinets were old and uneven. There were stains on the walls that had been painted over instead of cleaned. The house had 2 floors. The kitchen and living room were downstairs, while both bedrooms were upstairs. My room had access to a bathroom in the hallway. My sister had a small private bathroom connected to her bedroom. Neither of us loved the place. But we told ourselves that we could handle a bad rental for 1 year. We had lived in cheap apartments before. We understood noisy pipes, difficult landlords, and old appliances. We did not expect perfection. We signed the lease. Almost immediately after moving in, strange things began happening. At first, they seemed like normal problems caused by an old house. Objects fell from the kitchen counters during the night. We would leave a bottle of cooking oil beside the stove, then find it lying on the floor the next morning. Cups, utensils, unopened food packages, and even heavier things would somehow move. 9 times out of 10, anything left on a counter would eventually end up on the floor. My sister blamed me. I blamed her. "Why do you keep leaving things down there?" she would ask. "I'm not touching your stuff." "Well, I'm not doing it. Maybe you're knocking things over before work. You're the one who gets home late." The arguments became common. We were both tired from moving, work, and trying to repair things the landlord refused to fix. It seemed easier to blame each other than to consider another explanation. Then, objects started disappearing. A set of keys would vanish from the table. A shirt would disappear from a laundry basket. A phone charger would be missing from beside the bed. We would search the entire house without finding the item. Then, several days or even weeks later, it would return. Sometimes it appeared on the dining table, sometimes on the kitchen counter. A few things appeared directly in the middle of our beds. There was no way we could have missed them. Once I lost a bracelet my mother had given me. I searched every drawer, bag, and room. My sister helped me look. 3 weeks later, I returned home from work and found it placed neatly in the center of my pillow. I immediately accused my sister. She became angry. I didn't take it. Then how did it get there? I don't know. You were the only person here. So were you before work. The arguments became worse because neither of us trusted what the other was saying. My sister's bathroom developed black mold. It appeared suddenly and spread frighteningly fast. 1 week, the walls looked normal. The next, black spots covered the corners of the ceiling and spread down the wall near the shower. She cleaned it with strong chemicals. It returned. We contacted the landlord several times. He said the bathroom only needed better airflow and told us to leave the window open. The window was painted shut. When we told him that, he stopped answering. The mold continued growing. It formed dark lines along the ceiling. It spread behind the toilet and around the edges of the mirror. My sister began avoiding the room whenever possible. Both of us also started having terrible nightmares. Mine were always about the house. I dreamed that I was standing downstairs while someone walked around above me. I could hear footsteps moving between the bedrooms, but every time I climbed the stairs, the upper hallway became longer. The bedroom doors moved farther away with every step. Sometimes I heard my sister calling me from one of the rooms. When I opened the door, there was no room behind it. Only darkness. My sister's dreams were different. She often dreamed that someone was standing beside her bed. She could not see its face, but she believed it looked like me. In the dream, the person would lean close and whisper things she could not remember after waking. We both began staying awake in each other's rooms. This was not because we were afraid of living alone. Before moving into that house, we had each lived alone for years. We were used to empty apartments, nighttime noises, and being responsible for ourselves. The house was different. Being alone inside, it felt wrong. My sister and I worked opposite schedules. I often came home when she was leaving, or she returned after I had already gone to bed. The only time we were regularly together was late at night. That made the early strange events more confusing. If something moved or disappeared, we assumed the other person had done it while we were away. It took several months before we understood that neither of us was responsible. The first incident that truly frightened me happened after work. My sister was supposed to be gone that evening. I knew she had a late shift, and I did not expect her home until after midnight. I entered the house, locked the door, and went upstairs. I was exhausted and wanted to shower before eating. My bathroom was in the hallway near my bedroom. I left my clothes in my room, entered the bathroom, and turned on the shower. The water pressure was weak, and the pipes made loud knocking sounds whenever someone used hot water. I had become used to it. I was standing beneath the water when I heard the front door open downstairs. A moment later, footsteps came up the stairs. I assumed my sister had returned early. "Hey," she called from the hallway. Her voice sounded completely normal. I answered from the shower. "What are you doing home?" She began telling me about work. The night before, we had talked about some drama involving one of her coworkers. That evening, she continued the story. She said someone had complained to the manager. She told me who was angry and who had been blamed. I asked questions, and she answered. We had a full conversation. I was not only hearing random words or noises, her voice responded directly to what I said. At one point, I laughed and told her that I had known the coworker would cause trouble. She laughed too. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then I turned off the water. I could still hear my sister speaking outside the bathroom. I stepped onto the bath mat and began drying myself. Her voice changed. It was only a small difference at first. The rhythm became slower. Some words sounded stretched. The tone became flat, as though she was repeating sounds she did not completely understand. I stopped moving. "What did you say?" I asked. There was no answer. I wrapped the towel around myself and stared at the closed bathroom door. "Hello?" Silence. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. My sister's bedroom door was open. Her room was dark. I walked toward it. "Sis?" No answer. I checked inside. No one was there. I went downstairs. The front door was still locked. The living room and kitchen were empty. I called my sister's name again, louder this time. Nothing. My hands began shaking. I grabbed my phone and called her. She answered after several rings. "What's wrong?" she asked. I could hear noise in the background. "Where are you?" "At work." "No, where are you right now?" "I just told you, I'm at work." "Have you been home?" "No, did you call me?" "No, why?" I stood in the kitchen, staring toward the stairs. I told her what had happened. There was a long pause. Then she became very quiet. "That happened to me," she said. "What?" "A few days ago." She explained that she had returned from a late shift and fallen asleep. Later, she heard me enter the house. She heard the front door. She heard my footsteps. Then, she heard me speaking outside her bedroom. The sound woke her. She called out to me. The voice answered. She said she could not remember exactly what we discussed because she was still half asleep, but she clearly remembered hearing my voice respond. She eventually got out of bed. No one was there. She checked the house and realized my car was gone. I had been at work the entire time. She had convinced herself that she had dreamed it. After my experience, she no longer believed that. Neither of us wanted to return to the house alone that night. I remained downstairs with every light turned on until she came home. When she arrived, we checked every room together. Nothing was missing. No doors were open. There was no sign that anyone had entered. We both had experience with strange places before. We had each lived in buildings where we heard unexplained footsteps or noticed lights switching on. We had family members who believed in spirits, and neither of us completely rejected the idea. But we had never experienced something that copied our voices. Over the next few weeks, it happened again. Sometimes, I heard my sister enter the house while she was still at work. Sometimes she heard me talking downstairs when I was miles away. The voice always sounded natural at first. It used our normal phrases. It knew things we had recently discussed. It could answer simple questions. But the longer the conversation continued, the stranger it became. One evening, I heard my sister call from downstairs. "Did you move my black jacket?" I answered from my room. "No. Check the chair. It isn't there." "Then, check your closet." There was a pause. Then her voice said, "Check your closet." I frowned. "What?" "Check your closet." The tone was wrong. It sounded exactly like my sister's voice, but there was no emotion behind it. I looked at my bedroom closet. The door was slightly open. I did not remember leaving it that way. "Where are you?" I called. The voice replied from the bottom of the stairs. "Check your closet." I climbed out of my bedroom window and waited on the roof until my sister came home. When we searched the closet later, nothing was inside. After that, we created rules. We always texted before coming home. If one of us heard the other person's voice, we checked our phones before answering. We created a private phrase that only the two of us knew. If we were unsure who was speaking, we asked for it. The thing in the house never answered correctly. Sometimes it ignored the question. Sometimes it repeated it. Once, it laughed. The worst incident happened when we were both home. It was late at night. We were upstairs in our separate bedrooms, watching television. Both bedroom doors were open. The house was quiet, except for the sound of our TVs. I was lying in bed when I heard voices downstairs. At first, I assumed my sister had gone to the kitchen and was speaking on the phone. Then I recognized my own voice. I sat up. The voice was coming from the living room below. It sounded as though I were having a casual conversation. A second voice answered. My sister's voice. I muted the television. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of my sister's television stopping too. Neither of us spoke. I stepped into the hallway. My sister appeared at her bedroom door at the same time. Her face was pale. We looked at each other. From downstairs, our voices continued talking. They were discussing something we had spoken about earlier that evening. My voice laughed. My sister's voice answered. We stood in the upstairs hallway, listening to ourselves hold a conversation in the empty living room. The copies sounded perfect. They paused naturally. They interrupted each other. They even used the small sounds we made while thinking. My sister silently pointed toward the stairs. I shook my head. I did not want to go down. Then, the conversation stopped. For several seconds, the house was silent. My voice spoke again. It was much closer. "Are you coming down?" My sister grabbed my arm. Her voice followed. "We're waiting." It sounded as though both voices were standing at the bottom of the stairs. We ran. We did not take phones, shoes, or jackets. We rushed into one bedroom, climbed through the window onto the lower roof, and dropped into the garden. We screamed the entire time. We ran to a neighbor's house and called our aunt. She was deeply spiritual and had always believed that some places could hold dangerous energy. We begged her to help us. She gave us a prayer to say together. She told us to write the words by hand, walk through every room with burning sage, and repeat the prayer. When we finished, we were supposed to burn the paper outside. Our aunt warned us not to speak to any voice we heard during the cleansing. She said that if something called our names, we had to ignore it. The next afternoon, she came with us to the house. We opened the windows. We lit the sage. The smoke moved strangely through the rooms. In some places, it drifted normally. Near the stairs in my sister's bathroom, it seemed to sink toward the floor. We said the prayer in every room. When we entered the living room, something moved upstairs. Footsteps crossed the hallway. My aunt continued praying. A cupboard opened in the kitchen by itself. We ignored it. Then my sister's voice called from the top of the stairs. "Please help me." My real sister stood beside me. She began crying. My aunt gripped her hand and told her not to answer. The voice repeated the words. This time, it sounded hurt. "Please help me." Then it changed into my voice. "She's hurting me." My aunt raised her voice and continued the prayer. The house became cold. The sage went out twice. We lit it again. When we finally finished, we took the handwritten prayer outside and placed it in a metal bowl. My aunt set fire to one corner. The paper curled as it burned. Black edges folded inward. When the flame died, part of the paper remained. The burned shape looked like an angel. There was a narrow body, 2 wide wings, and what appeared to be a head. We took a photograph because none of us could believe it. My aunt said it was a sign that we had been protected. For several days, the house was quiet. Nothing fell from the counters. No objects disappeared. We did not hear our own voices. But the feeling inside the house never completely changed. The silence felt temporary, like something had only stepped back. A week later, I woke during the night and heard breathing outside my bedroom door. I texted my sister. She answered immediately from her room. Neither of us opened our doors until sunrise. We decided we could not stay. Breaking the lease cost us money, and the landlord threatened legal action. We did not care. We packed quickly. We refused to remain inside after dark. Friends helped us move our furniture during the day. On the final afternoon, I carried the last box downstairs. As I reached the front door, I heard my sister call from the kitchen. "Can you help me?" I almost answered. Then I remembered that my sister had already left with the moving truck. I did not turn around. I walked outside and locked the door. We did not discuss the house for several months. Neither of us wanted to remember it. Eventually, we began comparing every detail. That was when we found a name for what we had experienced. A mimic. Something that copies voices, habits, and sometimes appearances to attract people or make them question reality. We also learned more about the history of the house. 2 previous tenants had died there. One had been shot. The other had taken their own life. We were never able to confirm every detail, and the landlord refused to answer questions. But neighbors knew about both deaths. One neighbor told us that the tenant before us often complained about hearing people speaking inside the house when no one else was home. Another said police had been called more than once because someone kept reporting an intruder, but officers never found anyone. I still have the photograph of the burned prayer. The shape looks like an angel. Some people see it and say it is only burned paper. Maybe they are right. But my sister and I know what happened in that house. We know we spoke to voices that belonged to each other while we were miles apart. We know we heard copies of ourselves talking downstairs while both of us stood upstairs. We know those voices asked us to come closer. I still refuse to answer when someone calls my name from another room unless I know exactly where they are. Sometimes my sister calls me and stays silent for a second too long. When that happens, I ask for our private phrase. She always answers correctly. But once, several years after we moved, my phone rang in the middle of the night. My sister's name appeared on the screen. I answered. Her voice whispered, "Are you coming down?" Then the call ended. I immediately called her back. She had been asleep. Her phone showed no outgoing call. We do not know whether the thing followed us. Maybe it only learned enough about us to reach us from somewhere else. Maybe leaving the house did not matter. We no longer live together, but we still follow the same rule. When one of us hears the other's voice in an empty room, we never answer. Because the worst thing about a mimic is not that it sounds like someone you love. It is that it listens long enough to learn exactly what will make you come closer. Years later, now that I am an adult, I have seen many stories online about children who remember seeing a tall man when they were young. Some people describe him as a shadow standing in the corner of a bedroom. Others say he watched them from the hallway or stood beside their bed at night. Most of the stories are easy to dismiss. Children have active imaginations. A hanging coat can look like a person in the dark. A curtain can move, and a frightened child can turn it into something much worse. I understand all of that. But what happened in my childhood is much harder to explain. It was not only something I saw once while half asleep. My younger brother saw it too. He saw it years later, in the same room, standing in the same corner. And no one had ever told him about what I used to see. Ever since I was very young, my parents said I seemed ahead of other children my age. I learned to walk and speak much earlier than expected. By around 8 months old, I was already walking around the house and saying small words clearly enough for my parents to understand me. My mother used to tell people that I had no interest in being a baby. I always wanted to move, explore, and understand what the adults around me were doing. I became frustrated when I could not reach something or explain what I wanted. Because I could walk so early, my parents gave me more freedom than most babies had. They created a playroom for me upstairs, where I could move around safely and play without getting into the kitchen cupboards or falling near the stairs. Our house had 3 bedrooms on the upper floor. The first was my parents' bedroom. The second room was used for storage. It contained old furniture, boxes of clothes, Christmas decorations, and other things my parents did not use often. The third room became my playroom. It was bright during the day because it had a large window facing the front of the house. My parents filled it with toys, soft mats, stuffed animals, and colorful plastic furniture. I had a small ball pit in one corner. There were building blocks, picture books, toy cars, dolls, and a large wooden toy box. I loved that room. According to my parents, I could stay inside it for hours without becoming bored. I moved from one toy to another, talking to myself and making up games. Most of my childhood memories from that age are not clear. Some of them may come from stories my parents told me later. But there are certain images from that playroom that still feel real. I remember sunlight on the carpet. I remember the smell of the wooden toy box. I remember the corner. That corner was beside the far wall, away from the window. It was not a particularly dark area. During the daytime, sunlight reached most of the room. At night, the ceiling light made every part of the room visible. There was nothing unusual in that corner except the toy box. Still, whenever my parents placed me near it, I became terrified. At first, they thought I was upset because I did not want to sit there. My mother said I would be laughing and playing one moment, and then the second she placed me near the toy box, my whole body changed. I would become still. My eyes would fix on something above the box. Then I would begin screaming. It was not normal crying. My parents said I cried very little as a baby. If I was hungry or tired, I made small noises, but I rarely became difficult. In that corner, however, I became completely hysterical. I screamed until my face turned red. Tears ran down my cheeks. I reached toward my parents and kicked my legs as if I were trying to escape from something. Every time, my eyes remained fixed on the same place, high above the toy box, near the ceiling. My mother would pick me up and carry me away from the corner. The moment I reached the other side of the room, I usually calmed down. This happened many times. At first, my parents searched the area for something that might frighten me. They checked behind the toy box. They moved it away from the wall. My father checked for insects, mice, loose wires, and strange shadows. There was nothing. They wondered whether the paint on that wall created an unusual shape. They changed the position of the lamp and removed a hanging decoration nearby. It made no difference. Whenever I looked toward that corner, I reacted as though someone was standing there. As I became older and learned to speak more clearly, my parents began asking what I was looking at. For a while, I could not explain it properly. I would point and cry. Sometimes I said man, other times I said there. My parents did not understand. Then, one day, I finally gave them a clear answer. There's a tall man in my room. My mother told me later that hearing those words frightened her badly. She asked me where the man was. I pointed toward the corner above the toy box. My father asked what he looked like. I said he was tall. That was all I could explain. I did not have the words to describe his clothes, face, or body. I only knew that he was much taller than my parents. I said he watched me. I also said he scared me. My parents tried to comfort me. My father walked into the corner and stood where I was pointing. He waved his arms and showed me there was no one behind him. See, he said, there's nobody here. But I continued staring past him. According to my mother, I looked as though I was watching someone standing directly behind my father. My parents began keeping the playroom door open whenever I was inside. Sometimes one of them stayed with me. For a few months, I continued speaking about the tall man. I saw him during the day. That is an important detail. This was not something that only happened at night when shadows filled the room. I saw him in the afternoon with sunlight coming through the window. I saw him while my parents stood beside me. Sometimes I was happy when I entered the room, but the moment I noticed him in the corner, I began crying. My parents considered moving the playroom to another part of the house. They did not, perhaps because the room was convenient and they could find nothing dangerous inside it. Over time, the incidents became less frequent. I stopped pointing at the corner. I stopped talking about the tall man. Eventually, I seemed to forget about him completely. My parents were relieved. They decided I had probably invented an imaginary person and frightened myself. Children create strange characters all the time. Maybe the tall man had been part of a dream. Maybe I had seen someone tall outside the house and carried the image into the playroom. Because I stopped mentioning him, my parents stopped discussing it too. They never brought it up in front of me. As I grew older, the playroom became less important. I started school and spent more time outside with friends. The ball pit disappeared. The baby toys were given away. The toy box remained for a while, but eventually it was moved into storage. By then, my younger brother had been born. He was 3 years younger than me. When he became old enough to leave the nursery, my old playroom was turned into his bedroom. The walls were repainted. The toys were removed. A bed was placed near one wall, with a small cabinet beside it. The corner where my toy box had once stood was left empty. There were no coats hanging there, no shelves, no tall lamps, nothing that could look like a person. I do not remember feeling afraid when the room became my brother's bedroom. By then, I had almost forgotten the tall man. My parents certainly never mentioned him. They did not want to frighten my brother or give him ideas. He was very different from me as a young child. He learned to walk and speak at a more normal age. At 2 or 3 years old, he could talk, but his sentences were simple. He had a louder personality than I did. He cried more easily, laughed more loudly, and demanded attention whenever he wanted something. My parents said he was a normal little boy. Nothing strange happened in his room at first. He slept there every night without a problem. Then, one night, my parents woke to the sound of him screaming. It was not normal crying. He was shouting, sobbing, and calling for them. My father ran from their bedroom while my mother followed. When they opened my brother's door, they found him sitting upright in bed. He was staring toward the empty corner. The same corner. His face was wet with tears, and his body was shaking. My mother turned on the main light. My father checked the room. The window was closed. The curtains were still. The closet door was shut. There was no one inside. My mother sat beside my brother and tried to calm him. She asked whether he had experienced the bad dream. He shook his head. My father asked what was wrong. My brother pointed toward the corner. There was a man. My parents looked at each other. What man? My mother asked. The tall man. Those words brought back everything they had tried to forget. My mother later told me that she felt cold all over. My father asked where the tall man had been standing. My brother pointed directly toward the place above the floor where I had always looked. What was he doing? Dad asked. My brother was still crying. He was watching me sleep. My mother pulled him close. She asked where the man had gone. My brother looked toward the ceiling light. He disappeared when you turned the light on. My parents searched the room again. My father looked under the bed and inside the closet. He checked the window and hallway. Nothing was there. They allowed my brother to sleep in their room that night. The next morning, they tried asking him more questions. He repeated the same story. A tall man had stood in the corner, watching him. He had not spoken. He disappeared when the light came on. My brother was too young to provide many details, but he was certain about what he had seen. My parents became deeply frightened because no one had ever told him about my experiences. They had not discussed the tall man for years. I had never mentioned him to my brother. At that age, I probably did not remember him clearly enough to tell the story anyway. My brother could not have heard it from another family member because my parents had only spoken about it privately. Still, he used the same words. Tall man. Same room. Same corner. My parents moved his bed after that. They placed it on the opposite side of the room, as far from the corner as possible. For a while, they left the hallway light on at night. My father also removed everything from the room that could create a strange shadow. There was already nothing in the corner. But he checked again. No pipes. No marks on the wall. No shapes outside the window. Nothing that might look human in dim light. My brother continued sleeping in the room, though my parents often checked on him. He never had another night as bad as that one. For a short period, he occasionally said the man was there. Sometimes he would avoid looking toward the corner. Other times, he said the tall man was gone. Eventually, like me, he stopped mentioning him. Years passed before my parents told me the whole story. I had grown old enough to understand why they were disturbed. They reminded me of my behavior in the playroom. They described the way I screamed and pointed toward the corner. Then, they told me what my brother had said years later. At first, I wondered whether my memory had affected him somehow. Maybe I had spoken about the tall man without remembering it. My parents were certain I had not. They had been careful never to discuss it near either of us. My brother had been only 2 or 3 years old when it happened. He was not old enough to invent a complicated story based on something from years before. Even if he somehow heard the words tall man, how would he know the exact corner? There was no toy box anymore. The room looked completely different, yet he stared toward the same place. The most troubling difference is that I usually saw the man during the day. My brother saw him at night. That meant he was not caused by one particular shadow. He was not a shape created by sunlight or darkness. Whatever we saw could appear at any time. As adults, my brother and I have tried to remember more details. My memories are unclear, but I still feel something when I think about that corner. I remember a shape that seemed too tall for the room. It did not stand normally. It almost seemed to reach from the floor to the ceiling, with its head tilted because there was not enough space. I cannot clearly remember a face. When I try, I see only darkness where the features should be. My brother remembers even less. He says he recalls waking and knowing someone was watching him. He remembers the feeling before he remembers the image. A heavy pressure. A certainty that if he moved or spoke, the man would come closer. Then he screamed. Our parents still talk about it today. My mother says it is one of the only events from our childhood that she cannot explain. My father is more careful. He says children can influence each other and create similar fears. But when he says that, he never looks convinced. They eventually sold the house. The decision had nothing to do with the tall man. We simply needed more space as my brother and I grew older. Before we moved, I went into my brother's room one last time. The room was empty. The furniture had already been taken away. I stood in the doorway and looked toward the corner. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then I felt the same fear I remembered from childhood. It came without warning. My stomach tightened. The skin on my arms became cold. I had the powerful feeling that someone was standing just outside my vision. I forced myself to look directly at the corner. It was empty. Still, I could not make myself enter the room. I closed the door and went downstairs. The new family who bought the house had 2 children. I sometimes wonder which room they chose for them. I wonder whether the corner is still empty. Perhaps the tall man belonged to our imagination. Maybe there was some unusual feature in the room that both our young minds understood as a figure. Maybe the house made noises that frightened us. Those explanations would be comforting. The problem is that neither my brother nor I described sounds. We described someone watching. We both saw a tall man. We both saw him in the same place. Neither of us was old enough to understand what that might mean. People often say children see things adults cannot. I do not know whether that is true. Maybe children only notice what adults have trained themselves to ignore. Maybe whatever stood in that room understood that. It never appeared to my parents. It waited until we were alone, small, and unable to explain ourselves properly. Then, when we became old enough to stop seeing it, it waited for the next child. That is the part that frightens me most. It did not leave when I stopped talking about it. It stayed in the corner for at least 3 more years. It waited for my brother's room to become quiet. Then it stood beside his bed and watched him sleep. I never believed in ghosts before this happened. I had heard plenty of stories growing up, of course. Everyone has. Haunted houses, strange footsteps, doors opening by themselves, people seeing shadows in empty rooms. I always thought there had to be a normal explanation behind every one of them. Old buildings make noise. People imagine things when they are tired. Lights and shadows can play tricks on your eyes. That was what I believed. Then I started working at a party center. The building was much larger than it looked from the outside. It had 3 different levels, and each floor was used for a different kind of event. The lowest level had a party room that people rented for birthdays, family celebrations, and smaller gatherings. It had its own kitchen area, dance floor, bathrooms, and storage rooms. The main floor had the ballroom. That was the most impressive part of the building. The ballroom had a polished wooden floor, high ceilings, large hanging lights, and enough space for hundreds of guests. Most weddings, large birthday parties, and formal events were held there. Above the ballroom was another level with narrow walkways and balconies. Staff members used that area to hang lights, banners, flowers, and other decorations over the dance floor. The upper level also led toward several offices, including my boss's office. During an event, the whole building could be very loud. Music traveled through the floors and walls. Guests moved between rooms. Staff shouted instructions to one another while carrying food, tables, chairs, and decorations. When the building was empty, however, it felt completely different. The hallways seemed longer. The ceilings seemed higher. Even your footsteps sounded wrong. I never thought the building was haunted. At least, not in the beginning. It was only an old event space to me. I had worked there long enough to know every room and hallway. I knew which doors stuck during wet weather and which floorboards made noise when someone stepped on them. I knew how long it took to walk from the downstairs kitchen to the main ballroom. I was comfortable there. That changed one night while I was working at a party downstairs. It was a normal shift. A family had rented the lower room for a birthday celebration. There were balloons everywhere, loud music, and children running between the tables. My job that evening involved helping with food, clearing plates, cleaning spills, and making sure the guests had whatever they needed. My coworker was working the same shift. We had worked together many times before, and we usually took our breaks at the same time whenever things became quiet enough. Around 9 that evening, the party downstairs began settling down. Most of the food had already been served. The cake had been cut, and many guests were sitting at the tables talking. My coworker and I asked if we could take our usual 20-minute lunch break. The manager agreed. Normally, we would eat in the small staff area near the kitchen. That night, however, the room was crowded with boxes and supplies. There was no event taking place in the ballroom on the main floor, so we decided to sit there instead. We carried our food upstairs. The ballroom was mostly dark. Only a few lights had been left on near the walls. The main ceiling lights were off, leaving the center of the room covered in soft shadows. The polished floor reflected what little light there was. The tables had been moved to the sides of the room, and the chairs were stacked neatly against one wall. Above us, the upper balconies formed dark shapes around the room. I had been in the empty ballroom many times before. It had never frightened me. That night, it felt peaceful. The loud music from downstairs was only a weak vibration beneath the floor. Every few seconds, we could hear people laughing, but the sounds seemed far away. My coworker and I sat at one of the tables near the edge of the ballroom. We opened our food and began eating. I do not remember exactly what we were talking about. Probably work, the guests downstairs, or what we were planning to do after our shift. Nothing felt unusual. Then, I saw movement above us. At first, it was only a pale shape at the edge of my vision. I turned my head slightly. A woman was walking along the upper balcony. She wore a plain white dress. The dress reached below her knees and moved lightly around her legs as she walked. Her hair looked dark, though I could not see her face clearly. She moved slowly across the balcony toward the hallway that led to my boss's office. She did not look down at us. She did not stop. She simply walked from one end of the balcony to the other and disappeared around the corner. For a second, I assumed she was a guest. Maybe someone from the downstairs party had wandered upstairs. Then, I remembered that guests were not supposed to be in the ballroom or upper level without permission. I stopped chewing. My coworker noticed the change in my face. "What?" he asked. I raised one finger to my lips. "Shh," I whispered. "Listen." He became quiet. We both sat completely still. I expected to hear footsteps above us. The upper floor was made of wood. It was almost impossible to walk across it silently, especially while wearing formal shoes. We heard nothing. No footsteps, no door opening, no voice. Only the weak sound of music coming from below. My coworker leaned closer. "What did you see?" There was a woman upstairs. He looked toward the balcony. "Where?" She walked toward the office. He stared at the dark hallway above us. "Are you sure?" "Yes, what did she look like?" "She was wearing white." He placed his food down. Neither of us said anything else. We stood and walked toward the stairs. I was not frightened yet. At that point, I believed we were going to find a confused guest. Maybe she was looking for the bathroom. Maybe she had gone upstairs to make a phone call. We climbed the stairs together. The hallway at the top was dark, except for one small light near the office door. My boss's office was at the far end. The door was closed. I looked at my coworker. That's where she went. He walked ahead and tried the office door. It was locked. We checked the nearby rooms. One was a storage room filled with boxes and old decorations. Another held sound equipment and extra lights. Both were empty. There was nowhere else for the woman to go. The balcony continued around part of the ballroom, but we could see the whole path from where we stood. No one was there. My coworker checked the office door again. Maybe she went back downstairs before we came up. She would have passed us. Maybe there's another staircase. There isn't. We both knew the building well. There was only one main staircase leading from the ballroom to the upper level. The other exit was behind a locked service door. We stood in the hallway for several seconds. Then my coworker laughed nervously. "You probably saw one of the curtains move. There aren't any curtains up here." A dress hanging in storage? She was walking. Maybe it was a reflection. I looked down into the ballroom. There were no large windows near the balcony. There was nothing that could have created the image I saw. Still, I wanted him to be right. We went back downstairs to the party room. I began looking at every guest. There were several women wearing light colors, but none wore a plain white dress. One woman wore a cream sweater. Another had a white shirt beneath a dark jacket. No one looked like the woman I had seen. I asked one of the other employees whether anyone had gone upstairs. She said no. The doors leading to the ballroom were supposed to remain closed during the downstairs event. I tried to forget about it. We returned to our lunch, but neither of us spoke as much as before. I kept looking toward the balcony. The upper level remained empty. After our break, we went back downstairs and continued working. The rest of the party went normally. Guests danced. Children ran around. People collected their coats and gifts before leaving. Nothing strange happened. By the time we finished cleaning, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the woman. Maybe I had been tired. Maybe a pale object had moved and my brain had turned it into a person. At the end of the shift, I told my manager what had happened. She laughed. "You saw a ghost?" she asked. "I saw a woman." "In a white dress?" "Yes," she smiled. You have been working too hard. My coworker confirmed that he had heard me mention the woman before we went upstairs, but he had not seen her himself. The manager continued laughing. There was no one up there. You probably saw a shadow. I did not argue. I collected my things and went home. That night, I thought about the woman while trying to sleep. I remembered the way she moved. She had not rushed or looked lost. She walked as if she knew exactly where she was going. I kept wondering why I had not seen her face. She was close enough that I should have noticed more details. Instead, I could only remember the white dress and the way it moved around her legs. Eventually, I fell asleep. A few days passed. Nothing else happened. I returned to work and began believing the whole experience had been nothing more than a mistake. Then I spoke to the chef. He had worked at the party center much longer than I had. He knew nearly everything about the building and often told stories about previous owners, strange guests, and events that had taken place years earlier. I found him in the kitchen preparing food for another party. For several minutes, I helped him carry ingredients and clean part of the counter. Then I asked, "Have you ever heard any ghost stories about this place?" He looked at me. "Why?" "I'm just curious." He smiled slightly. "What did you see?" The question surprised me. I didn't say I saw anything. You wouldn't ask unless something happened. I hesitated. "Have you heard stories or not?" The chef placed the knife he was holding onto the counter. He wiped his hands on his apron. "This building wasn't always a party center," he said. "What was it?" "A mansion." I looked around the kitchen. It was difficult to imagine the building as someone's home. He explained that a wealthy family had lived there many years before. The ballroom had once been used for private parties, formal dinners, and dances. The upper level had allowed musicians and staff to move around without crossing the main floor. Some of the offices had once been bedrooms. He said the building had changed owners several times before becoming an event center. "Did anyone die here?" I asked. The chef shrugged. "Probably. It's an old place. That's not helpful." He laughed. Then his expression became more serious. "I've heard people say they've seen things." "What kind of things?" He looked toward the kitchen door before answering. "A man in a tuxedo." My skin began to feel cold. "And a woman," he continued. "What kind of woman?" He stared at me for a moment. "A woman in a white dress." The room seemed to become quieter. I stopped moving. The chef noticed my expression. "What?" I told him everything. I explained the empty ballroom, the upper balcony, and the woman walking toward the office. He listened without laughing. When I finished, he looked uncomfortable. "You saw her on the upper floor?" "Yes, near the office?" "Yes," he glanced toward the ceiling. "That's where people usually see her." I felt cold despite the heat from the kitchen. "Who is she?" "I don't know." "Did she live here?" Maybe he picked up the knife again, but did not continue working. "Some people think she was connected to the family who owned the mansion. Others say the white dress was a wedding dress." It didn't look like a wedding dress. Stories change. "What about the man?" "The man in the tuxedo is usually seen downstairs or near the ballroom entrance." "Are they together?" The chef shrugged. "No one knows." I asked whether he had ever seen either of them. He shook his head. "I've heard footsteps upstairs when the building was empty. I've heard doors open and close, but I've never seen them." I wanted to know more, but he suddenly changed the subject. An hour later, I saw him speaking quietly with my manager. Both of them looked toward me. That made me wonder whether she had known about the stories when she laughed. I never asked her. After speaking to the chef, the building felt different. The ballroom no longer seemed empty when the lights were off. Whenever I worked late, I found myself checking the upper balcony. Sometimes I thought I saw movement near the office hallway. It was never clear enough to be certain. I began avoiding lunch breaks in the ballroom. My coworker did too, though he never admitted being frightened. Nothing else happened for several months. Then, one night, I was helping close the building after a wedding. The ballroom had been full of guests only an hour earlier. Now the tables were empty, and the cleaning staff were working downstairs. I remained on the main floor, collecting glasses and napkins. The upper balconies were dark. As I carried a tray toward the kitchen, I heard a sound above me. Footsteps, slow, clear, one step after another. They moved across the balcony toward the office. I stopped in the middle of the ballroom. The footsteps continued. Then, they stopped. I looked up. The balcony was empty. I told myself it was another employee. Then the door to my boss's office opened. A thin line of darkness appeared between the door and the frame. The office light was off. No one came out. I placed the tray down. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I walked toward the stairs. Before I reached them, the office door slowly closed. I did not go upstairs. I found the manager and told her the office door had opened. She checked it. The door was locked. She said it must not have been closed properly. I did not mention the footsteps. After that, I began hearing stories from other workers. One employee said she had seen a man standing near the ballroom doors after midnight. He wore a dark tuxedo and disappeared when she turned on the main lights. Another worker said she once heard a woman crying in the upper hallway. A cleaner claimed she found wet footprints on the ballroom floor, even though it had not rained and every entrance was locked. Most people laughed while telling the stories. I noticed they never stayed alone in the building after dark. I never saw the woman again. Not clearly. Sometimes, when I walk through the ballroom, I feel as if someone is watching from above. I look toward the balcony and see nothing. Other times, I catch a pale shape moving near my boss's office. When I turn my head, it is gone. I still work there. Years have passed since that night. Nothing has happened that frightened me as much as the first sight of the woman in the white dress. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe I was tired. Maybe someone had entered the ballroom without permission and found another way out. I have tried to accept those explanations. The problem is that none of them explain how the chef knew exactly what I had seen before I told him. They do not explain why other people have reported the same woman. And they do not explain what happened last week. I was finishing a late shift when I walked through the empty ballroom. The lights were low, almost exactly as they had been that first night. I looked toward the upper balcony. A woman in a white dress stood near my boss's office. She did not walk away this time. She looked down at me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were dark. Beside her stood a man wearing a black tuxedo. They were holding hands. I could not move. The man raised one arm and slowly pointed toward the floor behind me. I turned. A table had been set in the middle of the empty ballroom. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 chairs. The lights flickered. When they came back on, the table was gone. So were the figures on the balcony. I left the building without finishing my work. I have not told my manager. She would probably laugh again. I still do not know who the woman was or what she wanted. Nothing has directly harmed me. Maybe the building is only holding on to moments from its past. Maybe the woman still walks toward that office because she did it every night when she was alive. Or maybe she is waiting for someone. All I know is that I no longer believe every ghost story has a simple explanation. Whenever I enter the empty ballroom, I look toward the balcony. Sometimes there is nothing there. Sometimes I see a flash of white moving through the darkness. And whenever I hear footsteps above me, I no longer go upstairs to check. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.